Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I am Vanessa Varden, the director of the Chicago Forum on Global Cities here at the Council. Special thanks to our partner for tonight's program, the Energy Policy Institute of Chicago at the University of Chicago. And welcome to our student groups from Purdue University Northwest and Northwestern. A few housekeeping points before we begin. Tonight's program is on the record and being live streamed, so please silence your phones, but do keep them handy as we will be taking questions through our online technology, the link to which you will see on the screens on either side of me rotating throughout the program. Simply navigate to chi.cnf.io on your web-enabled device and select tonight's program to submit a question or vote on which questions you would like asked. At the conclusion of tonight's program, the bar will reopen for 30 minutes, so we encourage our members and guests to stay and continue the conversation while networking. For nearly a century, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Tonight's program is part of the Council's work on global cities, promoting a cross-sector dialogue on the power and limitations of global cities to shape the world's future. Please visit our website to view our original research on global cities and other upcoming events. Back to this evening, we have 3 experts with us to discuss climate change and those most particularly affected by it. Alice Hill is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Most recently, she served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Resilience Policy for the National Security Council under the Obama administration. She is also the former Senior Counselor to the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security and served as an ex officio member of the Federal Advisory Committee for the National Climate Assessment. She holds her BA from Stanford University and JD from the University of Virginia Law School. Amir Jinnah is an assistant professor at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy, as well as a senior fellow at the Energy Policy Institute of Chicago. Amir is an environmental and developmental economist and a founding member of the Climate Impact Lab. He holds a PhD in sustainable development and a master's in climate and society from Columbia University, as well as BAs in both mathematics and theoretical physics from Trinity College, Dublin. And finally, our moderator, Karen Weigert, is a senior fellow here at the Council for Global Cities and was formerly the Chief Sustainability Officer for the City of Chicago. Karen will lead the conversation on stage and ask for your questions a little later in the evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Well, thank you, all of you, and welcome to our conversation tonight. We're really lucky to have this discussion with the folks who are sitting to my left, and so let's just jump in. Alice, I'd love to start with you. And from the vantage points that you've had in thinking about this issue, both across the globe, but specifically within the U.S., help ground climate change for us. What does this mean on the ground in the United States?
It's always said, and should be said, that you can't tie any particular event to climate change, although the attribution science is improving rapidly. But 2017 is a wonderful example of what is ahead for us. It's given us, certainly, in my opinion, a wake-up call. If you'll think about February of this year, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, it hit 99 degrees. Now, I'm sure you all in Chicago know that's not what you're expecting in Oklahoma in the winter. As we moved on, we had extreme drought conditions in the western United States, affecting deeply communities there that rely on forestry, cattle. Our western states were deeply hit. We then moved on to hurricanes, Harvey, Irma, Maria. We are still suffering from those impacts, 55 inches of rain in Houston. And then, of course, Puerto Rico has had very severe impacts. In fact, today I heard that their power was out again. We're more than a month out from the event. And FEMA is spending $200 million a day on recovery efforts. And then, of course, we had the wildfires in California, devastating to the beloved Napa Valley. The National Intelligence Council has been concerned about the possibility of back-to-back extreme weather events and what that does to a strong economy like ours, a very strong economy, but also globally to other economies that are having similar kinds of impacts. Meanwhile, on our eastern seaboard primarily, somewhat less on the western seaboard, we have relentless sea level rise. So we have sunny day flooding occurring in Norfolk, Virginia, where we have 30 military installations, the largest naval port in the world. And it has already suffered severe flooding so that it floods just on a plain old sunny day because there are high tides. Similarly in Miami. Of course, we haven't even gotten to the Gulf Coast that's losing approximately a football field of land an hour. That's a glimpse of what climate change looks like. As we continue to heat up, which we will, even if we cut our emissions to zero today, we will continue to heat up. As that heat comes in and the impacts increase, we will see that the impacts accelerate and become even more severe. One of the underappreciated risks, but I think it's very appreciated in Chicago, given your history in, I believe it's 1995, extreme heat. That will be one of the real challenges for us in certain areas in the United States because we're going to have more events of extreme heat. Essentially, it's just pushed to the curve to the right. So we will all be attempting to deal with that. Of course, during those events, our ability to generate power, at least as we are currently structure our power systems, is reduced. So that puts more people at greater risk. So I think 2017 gives us a wonderful hint. I would not anticipate it would look better going forward. Over maybe a year will look better, but over time we will have even more impacts than we experienced this year.
It's an extraordinary year, and it puts a very detailed context around some of the challenges, and it really brings it home to the United States. And Amir, you've done an extraordinary amount of research, but you've also had a great deal of experience working and thinking internationally. What does this look like outside of the borders of the U.S.?
So I originally started my career and my studies looking more on the physical side of climate, and in early work in doing that, I realized that the impacts that it was having on people were essentially what would drive my research forward afterwards. So it was going to places like Bangladesh and seeing households that are affected by flooding each year and just seeing their adaptive capacity to these types of hazards just being strained with each successive flood that they experience, with each successive typhoon or tropical cyclone that came to hit them. And it was very clear in looking at that, doing field work, trying to work with farmers or with people in rural villages in different parts of South Asia, that these impacts were not hitting everybody equally. And so to me, that's been the largest or the most dramatic expression of climate change that I've seen. Was one story which I think has pushed me in the direction of the research that I've been doing, where I was working with the Red Cross, Red Crescent in Bangladesh, looking at people's adaptive strategies for climate change and doing this in a very, I thought, hard-headed scientific way. And in this focus group that we were having, at one point somebody mentioned that one of their family members had died in a flood, and I was shocked by this. And my translator said, "Oh no, well, this kind of thing happens all the time," and asked people in this group of maybe 20 or 30 to put up their hands if they had lost someone in the past 5 years because of some climate-related incident, and maybe about 50% of them did. And then I heard this story of one woman who had to make a choice between saving her livestock and her child. She left her child unattended in her home, and the baby subsequently died in rising floodwaters. And she had to make that trade-off. And so for me, internationally, this looks like something where the people who are the poorest in the world are ones who are having to make these extremely difficult trade-offs within their life because they just don't have the economic ability to cope with any of these hazards.
When you see footage of climate change or you hear stories, so often Bangladesh is held up as an example, and the challenges are beyond the reach I think, what many of the folks in this room may have seen here in the US, despite the extraordinary challenges, Alice, that you just framed for us. But Amir, I know you were doing some research that actually does look at the US and quantifying climate change. Can you talk a little bit about how we take these themes that we're hearing about and array them across our country? And what does the data tell us about the impacts?
One of the advantages about working on the US is that the data is much better than things you would get in other countries, and so you can actually perform this type of analysis here in a way you couldn't in many places around the world. That was one of the reasons to dive in very deeply into the United States and look at people's health and well-being and economic outcomes. What we find when looking at the current relationships to weather and climate, it's actually quite surprising that even in the US, the richest country in the world, somewhere you'd expect to be to have the least vulnerability to these types of exposures, you see that there is big effects on health, as was just mentioned, on labor productivity, on agriculture that still persist even today. These are things which will get worse into the future. So in looking at those underlying data, we see very strongly non-linear relationships, which I think was kind of the surprising thing. So as temperature warms, the effects of increasing temperature gets worse. And so we're in the US, even though very wealthy and in some cases very well able to adapt, we're right on the edge in some places of those thresholds where climate change impacts start to get much worse. And so in our research recently, we thought we would find modest effects. We're looking at both the benefits and the damages, and we're trying to say, if there's a heat wave which will harm people, the decrease in cold days will help people's health because you're not exposed to as many health-damaging cold days. But we were surprised to see that on net, the US economy seems to suffer when looking at a number of different sectors. And not only that, but the pattern is very unequally distributed across the country. So a surprising thing to find in the world's richest country, and extending that globally can only show that pattern, I think, to a much greater degree.
And you even quantified it. A degree of warming causes X impact on GDP.
Yes, about 1 degree Celsius, 2 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly about 1.2% of GDP loss per year.
And then my recollection also is there are counties where that number is just much, much higher in the United States today.
Yeah. So this was on average across the whole country, but then what we would see is that the southern United States, for reasons that I'm talking about, these types of thresholds, and almost a perfect storm of impacts, inadvertently using the word storm, but people who are suffering from sea level rise, enhanced hurricane activity, and also being very close to these damaging temperature thresholds, there's counties that are losing about 20-30% of their local incomes per capita. So some enormous effects, and very unequally distributed across the United States.
So when you dig into a data like that, it's new data in a sense. I mean, since you're quantifying what has been seen but hasn't really been put into numerical terms. And I know, Alice, when you started in the Obama administration, you actually started, I think, in the Department of Homeland Security.
Yes.
But it wasn't about quantifying climate change. It was essentially asking the question, is this an issue for us?
President Obama had just signed an executive order requiring all federal agencies to engage in sustainability planning, so cutting emissions of the federal government, plus requiring adaptation planning. And I was the new person at DHS. I had formerly been a judge on the Los Angeles Superior Court, newly arrived at the Department of Homeland Security, and if you've ever worked in a very large bureaucracy, DHS has 240,000 employees. I was the new person in the management team, and honestly, no one else wanted to do this assignment, so they said, they looked around the room, give it to her. And fortunately for me, I found it a fascinating topic. Because I didn't have a deep background in the sciences or really about climate change, I was asked to assemble a task force to answer the question, should DHS, which DHS has FEMA, Coast Guard, TSA, ICE, our customs, they handle our borders, huge security agency, should that agency in 2009 care about climate change? And not cutting emissions, care about the impacts of climate change. So we were able to benefit from the work of the Navy, Task Force Climate Change, as well as other experts in the Department of Defense, NASA, NOAA. We all concluded that we needed to care deeply. And so then we wrote the first adaptation plan for DHS, which called out the various risks to our missions. And one of the very large, obvious risks is the risk to FEMA, which we're already seeing right now. They're very much under a lot of stress, given the succession of impacts that we've just had this year.
In the work that you saw, how did this extend to the way the U.S. interacts internationally? So how did this impact when U.S. dollars are going overseas, either in military events or in aid, to places that Amir might be researching outside of our boundaries?
So two concerns, primary concerns that as we're really learning about how the nation can best prepare for climate change impacts. One concern was our own national security and how that would be affected by climate change. That would mean our coastal installations. I mentioned Norfolk, which is suffering from subsidence. The land is sinking, plus sea level rise. Huge investments of the federal government. We have military installations at risk from sea level rise all over the world, and all of those will need some kind of remediation work, or virtually all of them. We have had instances where it simply got too hot in the West for very young, healthy people to train outside because the heats we're experiencing. So we needed to look at those things. We did, when I was in the White House, complete a executive order. President Obama signed it, which required all of our science agencies, our intelligence agencies, and our security agencies to incorporate consideration of climate change impacts in their strategy and planning. So you have the scientists inform the intelligence agencies, and then the intelligence agencies inform the policymakers. President Trump did decide to rescind that order, so there is no such order currently in place. We also did another order that looked at the other side of this, which you were referencing, our development work. So we want to make sure that nations that are of strategic interest to us are not rendered even more vulnerable or even unstable and have political, severe, significant political consequences as a result of climate change. If you look at the events in Syria, academics will tell you that a severe drought, at least the worst in 1,000 years, led to a massive movement of primarily young men within the country. Many other factors played in. Lots of other things happened, including President Assad's approach to this drought. But as a result of that, 5 million people essentially exited, and you've seen what's happened in Europe. And that's a grave concern to us. If other countries are destabilized as the result of climate change impacts, what does that mean for the United States? So President Obama signed another executive order that requires all of our development work to be screened for climate resilience, to make sure that if we're going to decide to invest in a country overseas, that investment will last for the projected impacts that over the life of the project. That executive order still is standing. President Trump has not decided to rescind that. As of yet. I don't know. So
if you take some of those ideas, that idea of the climate impact and the consistency or the persistence of impact. Amir, one of the things that's been interesting in some of the research that you've done has been looking what happens to poverty rates after a storm or after a hurricane. Help us understand what this looks like even in the US. There's an event that is related to climate, certainly not directly attributable, but in line with projections, and a neighborhood, a community is hit by a hurricane. What happens?
So we've looked at the effects on effectively national economic growth after a hurricane. There was this view within academic economics that what should be happening is places build back better. So a hurricane comes in and knocks down a bunch of old, redundant factories, and you build new, bright, shiny ones that are more productive. And that's something which, to some extent, you do observe on a very local scale. You could look at Houston over the course of the next decade and probably see a lot of extra growth and the city bouncing back. But what we decided to do was look very broadly. So there's a situation where federal funding goes towards rebuilding, and it rightly goes towards rebuilding and recovery in a situation, in a post-disaster situation. But where does that money come from, or what could have been doing in the absence of that disaster? And so when we look at all of these things on net for every country around the world, rich and poor alike, you start to see that economic growth declines, and it doesn't really recover even after 20 or 30 years. And it's this very slow decline because the investments are not being made in other places. You might think, well, is this something happening in a poorer country? Is this happening in the US? There's many reasons why this, so it's something which holds for the US as well. And there's a lot of different mechanisms that might be making that happen. One which I think is particularly compelling is a piece of research done by a colleague at Urbana-Champaign, looking at the effect of hurricane strikes on the Atlantic coast of the US on unemployment insurance receipts. And it finds that the direct recovery costs are dwarfed by what's being paid for a decade later in unemployment insurance, by a factor of 10. And so this is something which is increasing this drain on the economy. And in that case, it's definitely it's as a result of inequalities, as a result of people who are, they might not look like they're losing the most because they're not losing their big mansion, which in many cases is insured, but they're losing their job because they can't show up for a week, someone in their family gets sick. So kind of smaller, less noticeable impacts, but they're the things which cumulatively are adding up to extremely large costs.
You know, within this, your analysis is essentially looking at poverty over time, and it's looking at different parts of the U.S. And my recollection is that not only is this a question of what's happening in specific counties, if you take that macro level and you look at the U.S. overall, it's actually different in different parts of the country, the South versus the North versus the West versus the East. Help us understand the geography. What does it look like for the U.S. as a whole, and why are different parts of the U.S. differently impacted?
So it goes back to one of those things I was saying earlier. There's places that are very close to these damaging thresholds. So in large swaths of the southern United States, health costs are one of the biggest contributors that we found to climate change costs or climate change damages. And a lot of the southern states are nudging up right against these damaging health thresholds. And so if we look at a business as usual trajectory going forward over the next 100 years, they're increasingly having days of damaging heat waves. There's many adaptations that people can adopt for that. So air conditioning is extremely protective against, in a way it solves a lot of the heat damaging problems of climate change, but it's also expensive and it costs a lot to run. And when you're in a situation where, this is a statistic which I heard yesterday, of 17% of households in the United States spend 10% of their incomes on electricity, they're operating on very fine margins, and spending more and more on air conditioning is one of those things which could confer a large benefit. It would also exacerbate climate change because of the extra use of energy if we stay on a fossil fuel system, but something which not a lot of people will be able to afford. So that's one of those reasons. You're looking at places which are already on average slightly poorer, who are being exposed to, who are right up against these thresholds where climate change starts to make the environment that we live in become much more damaging.
Yeah, so this is the context which the federal government is thinking through its opportunities and its actions. And Alice, when you were looking at that, obviously you had an extraordinary purview both at the Department of Homeland Security and then in the White House. And I'd be curious to know, what are some of the ideas that started to come through in terms of specific pathways that help reduce the impacts that we're starting to talk about?
Most importantly, we want to look at what investments we make now and make sure that they're resilient. So I'm sure all of you have heard, and you experience it here in the United States, our infrastructure needs a lot of investment. And if you're going to spend money on a bridge, a tunnel, a road, whatever it is, you should look at the service life for that particular piece of infrastructure. And in many instances, it may last for well over 100 years. And if you're looking at a 100-year investment, I'll just give Washington, D.C., we hear a lot about the sewers of Washington, D.C. Ironically, the sewers in Washington, D.C., many of them were constructed in pre-Civil War or during the Civil War, and those are still in place. So kudos to the folks that assembled that they can still handle the extreme waste that has to go out. But we have a challenge with extreme precipitation that we're going to have to change our pipes over time. We need to make sure we think about building those bigger. Culverts, these are the type of things. So after a hurricane, many of our culverts are washed out from flooding. Under even our current standards, we just build back what's there. And we already know that culvert couldn't handle the water that came down in the flood event. It's something like the savings, if you spend, it's 600 to 1. For every dollar you spend, you get a 600% return on reduced maintenance costs, on flow of water, for expanding the size of your culvert. Similarly, if our studies show that if you spend $1 to reduce your risk in advance of an event, you save $4 in these recovery dollars when you're going back and having to rebuild. If we had built it better to begin with, we would have fewer damages. That's not our current model. There are a whole host of reasons, including political will, why that doesn't occur. We have looked at politicians' terms. You may have heard this expression, NIMT, not in my term. So for the average politician, it's hard to say, I want to spend $1 million here to mitigate risk that we're not really sure when it's going to arrive, how it's going to arrive, and probably won't arrive in my term, versus $100 million on good schools, crime, fighting terrorism that they think their constituents are more interested in. So we find that typically, as we are seeing right now, we spend much more on the recovery. That's what we did in Sandy. We attempted to do some things better after Sandy, and we'll also see very significant bailouts from the federal government to take care of the most recent events. The goal would be to push it from recovery to really pre-event mitigation of risk. That just saves us all money and keeps us more economically strong because the hit to the economy is less if your buildings can withstand the damage that we know are from high winds, flooding, and things like relentless sea level rise. We just built a beautiful new bridge in California after the Loma Prieta earthquake, $8 billion bridge. They did not account for sea level rise in the planning of the bridge. So right as you enter that bridge on the toll booth, they already need $17 million worth of flood mitigation. We need to be thinking about that before we make major investments. What's it going to look like as we see these impacts come in?
Yeah, you had this great line, I think, the other day, and it was, we build to withstand the risks of the past.
Yes.
And the risks of the future look a little different these days.
Well, that's just if I could say, that is probably the major challenge with climate change. All of our building codes, all of our building practices, when you're thinking about infrastructure, are based at looking at historic risk. How often did this property flood? How often did we experience high winds? And how high did the temperatures ever get? I don't know, how many of you watched the World Series at the Dodger Stadium? Well, if you saw the scoreboard, it said it was 10 degrees. That's because they didn't have another digit to say 110 degrees. And that just reflects the assumptions underlying all of who would ever need to have a third digit there? Well, now we will, routinely in Los Angeles. So, but that is a complete mind shift in our mindset. None of our building codes systematically incorporate future risk. None of our flood maps incorporate future risk. We are sitting, planning, building to what happened in the past, even though we have great examples given to us even this year on what our future looks like. But it's a complete change of thinking requiring many, many participants, engineers, architects, city planners, urban planners. Insurers probably are more on top of this than many. and policymakers generally to understand that historic risk can inform the future, but you also need to look at something that we've never done before. How do we plan for something we've never experienced before?
Yeah. And so that look ahead, those questions of what are the beginnings of some of those decisions that might be made differently? I mean, there are many historical examples already, but one is Hurricane Andrew. And if you would mind talking a little bit about Hurricane Andrew was an extraordinary event, but there was a change made afterwards to think about what those impacts were. I'd love to use that as a starting point to think of where do we see some of these forward-looking approaches?
In 1992, Hurricane Andrew hit Florida. It packed some of the, I think it was Category 5 when it hit, about 165 mile per hour winds. And there was very significant damages to homes. Over 100,000 homes significantly either destroyed or impaired. And we learned from that we weren't enforcing our building codes very well in Florida, and that also the building codes weren't strong enough. So the state of Florida essentially said, never again. We're going to do this better. It took them a while, but in 2002, I believe, they put in one of the strongest building codes ever, particularly for wind. And then in 2004, I believe, Hurricane Charlie plus 3 other, Janine, and I've forgotten the other names, came in. And it was a perfect example because you had the newly constructed homes that were constructed to this very strong building standard, and then all, of course, the existing stock that had not been retrofitted. The new homes did extremely well. So Florida has kept that building code in place, ironically, till just this year. Florida decided we're going to begin to backtrack from having the highest standards in our building codes. And that's something that is a grave risk because all of us naturally make our decisions based on what we've experienced in the past. And Florida had not experienced a significant event for quite a while, so it begins to feel like I don't really need that. We see the same thing with insurance. After an event, people go out and get insurance, even though the likelihood of the event hasn't necessarily increased because you've experienced it, but it's you remember it, it's availability. But then over time, people drop their insurance and they become vulnerable again. So there's a lot of behavioral economics or social science work that we need to do to understand to help how we can better nudge each of us to make better risk decisions when it comes to something like, do we keep the insurance on our home?
Just to add slightly to that, so the Chicago heat wave, which you mentioned earlier, was another one of these sea changes in dealing with heat. And so it was the advent of coordinated cooling centers and other incredibly beneficial policies that now have spread across the whole country and to other parts of the world as well. It seems like it's on the back of these very dramatic incidents that we start to learn, and it galvanizes policy to some extent. One can only hope that the hurricanes this summer and the strain that FEMA is under will start to shine more of a light on it. But if it doesn't fall within the right policy context, it seems like it's going to be
Well, I would just say one challenge we have is, as I mentioned, our building codes don't yet incorporate future risk. So all of us want to build back better. That makes just sense. But honestly, we don't really always know how to build back better. And so for the politicians who need to get their communities back up and running, there's tremendous pressure just to put it back as it was. And people, through the emotional trauma of that kind of event, we see a lot of demand naturally for people. I want to just put my home right where it was. I don't want to be told that I need to move back further or that I need to elevate it. I just want to get back into my house as it was. And so there's a lot of pressure. And then when we don't have a good thing that we can take off the shelf and say, well, if you just built it this way, you would be safe. We aren't that prepared yet. So we're still in this area where when these big events occur, there'll be tremendous pressure just to put it back as it was. And so you're hopeful that communities do what Florida did, but it didn't happen in 1993. It took them about 8 years to get to a higher building standard. So we'll see a lot put back in Puerto Rico and other places, just as it was. I will say Houston has said they want to do a lot of buyouts of homes, which would be an excellent thing to just move people out of the floodplains so they're not going to have repetitive flooding there.
You know, when you brought up Chicago, and when you think about the devastation that this city experienced in that heat wave in 1995, and the many kind of solution pieces that emerged from that, and you talked about the cooling centers as one. Well, one that became standard in Chicago was essentially white roofs, which helps to protect the inhabitants inside who may be inside if they're not in a cooling center. And I think that's moved around the world as well, and I'd love to know if you've got experience with any technology like that that might have
It's a very leading question.
So I'm leading the witness.
With the University of Chicago Urban Labs, I'm working on a project in Delhi at the moment. So one of the interesting things that comes up is, do we know how to build back better? Do we know how to incorporate future risks? Maybe not yet in a policy sense, but the science is there for us to do that.
Absolutely.
The political and the political will is maybe not there to incorporate it, but the science is quite good and is able to quantify the uncertainty and other things. When looking at that, when seeing what these impacts are, it makes sense to try and think of, without a large-scale, enormous infrastructure change in some of the more vulnerable places, so Delhi in the one in particular where we're working, what's a low-cost way to decrease some of these impacts? And again, coming back to the point of inequality that I'd mentioned earlier, when it's particularly the poorest people who are more exposed, who are suffering from those impacts more, what is a low-cost way that you can protect or improve the well-being of people there? So what we're doing at the moment is we're trialing a project of effectively white roofs across it's a resettlement colony. So former slum dwellers in Delhi moved to this one location, and they're experiencing, I'm from Europe, so I'm going to say this in Celsius terms, but they're experiencing 45 degrees Celsius days. That's 100 and something, 110, 115. I was actually out there in May during the hottest time of year, and the weather reports for the week that I was there was, I think, 116 degrees every single day. And while I go out and go to this community and go back to my air-conditioned car and drink some water, people are stuck in that constantly and have to work, have to go to school. People are getting sick from dehydration. And so we think the benefits there could be enormous if this technology can actually help them in that way. So there's lots of solutions that we're trying to trial. This is not a place where air conditioning would be particularly accessible. So what do you do when the resource constraint is more binding? Well, you find the low-cost way that might help people to some extent, that then it doesn't interrupt their livelihood, so they can make that money and eventually invest in better infrastructure themselves. So try and decrease the impacts on their own ability to adapt long enough for them to grow into a place where they're less vulnerable.
Yeah. And Alice, what else gives you opportunities to think of, here are the ways things are working or they could work? There are examples of impacts. The example of Hurricane Andrew and building codes is one. What are the other things that you look at and you say, listen, it's working there, it's a scale opportunity for us?
One of the more inspiring stories I recently heard was from a friend who's from Bangladesh. And Bangladesh has terrible flooding. It's, as we've talked, very impoverished country. And this spring, Asia was terribly hit with flooding. Bangladesh, 8 million people were flooded. Historically, and this will be a greater risk for all of us, we saw with Houston's floodwaters, people had developed skin disease from being in the floodwaters, and they had a lot of health impacts as a result of having to wade through. Bangladesh has taken on the public health threat posed by routine flooding, and in this past very serious floods they experienced, there were virtually no cholera cases because they had tremendous messaging that you need to have good hygiene. So as it was described to me, even people who are wading through chest-deep waters knew that they couldn't ingest those waters and that as soon as they were out of there, they needed to practice good hygiene. They had saline solution, oral saline available for their children. They had public health workers going out to visit the displaced families to make sure that those families remained healthy. And according to their public health reports, they had virtually no deaths as a result of this kind of diarrheal diseases following a flood. Very low cost. It's really a public messaging and making sure that fresh water is available, but hugely exciting to think that an impoverished nation can take on a critical risk, plan for it, and when the bad thing happens, know what to do and make sure that their population's protected.
Excellent. So from building codes to public health to potentially new technologies, from Chicago to Delhi, opportunities to think ahead. With that, I'd love to open it up to the audience to bring in some questions. And if you would, we have folks with mics, and please, if you have a question, please make it a question, and we'd love to be able to bring a few other folks into this conversation with the experts that we're lucky enough to have with us tonight. So who'd like to start us off? Sure.
Hi. You started off with a lot of conversation when we were talking about the U.S. about communities and counties being near certain thresholds. Can you speak a little bit about what you're talking about there, what those thresholds are? Are they like certain temperatures? Are they certain latitudes? What do those mean?
Do we want to collect questions or just
No, we'll take them as they
okay.
come.
So in that, I'm talking about any climate or weather threshold that people are experiencing. So there's the number of people whose health is severely damaged, even to the point of dying, starts to increase dramatically once you exceed 90 degrees Fahrenheit as an average daily temperature. And then it just skyrockets basically above that. And so there's places where the temperature distribution is seeing a few of those days at the moment, but as it shifts, they start to cross that threshold more frequently. And that seems to hold for a lot of things. It holds for people's health, for crops, for crime rates. It holds for a lot of different phenomenon of importance to us. And so these temperatures of in and around 90 Fahrenheit, 100 degrees Fahrenheit of daily average temperatures seem to be quite meaningful in terms of expressing the limits of the way that we've structured our economy and our health and other things.
Please, there's a mic coming.
A lot of some of this discussion was focused on places that had been developed on floodplains or houses, say, that were built too close to the ocean. Why would you say that a lot of the really old developments, particularly in coastal areas, it seems like those developers knew better than to build too close to the ocean? How come, why would you say they knew better than to build too close to the ocean or on a floodplain, whereas opposed to, say, a lot of the stuff like in Houston, those developers just saw open land and decided to build without taking that into consideration? Thank you.
Well, we've historically developed along rivers, and we've developed along the sea. We have seen more coastal development in the last 50 years than we had historically. Just our numbers have increased and more people want to live on the coast. We don't have fully accurate flood maps, and particularly with extreme precipitation, it's very difficult for us to accurately predict the water flows with extreme precipitation. Now, I'm not saying that Houston may not, actually Houston was aware of their flood risk to some extent, because I was in Houston in 2014 meeting with the city and talking about the flood risk from a big storm. So that wasn't an unknown risk. I think they would admit that. But Our flood maps are not entirely accurate, so people who purchased outside the flood map might not have been on notice as well as someone in the flood map. But we have incentive structures that encourage governments to allow more development. If you look at the state of Florida, they don't have a state income tax. Miami Beach relies on a lot of building permit revenue as well as property tax. So that gives you an incentive to allow a lot of development, and that development, those taxes from that will then allow you to adapt, but at some point you'll just hit a curve where you can't adapt anymore, and those properties will be flooded. Houston similarly doesn't have, Texas does not have an income tax, so they're dependent on their property tax. So there are different incentives for governments to allow different levels of development, and that's something we need to examine our land use choices going forward. The question is, Houston, Miami, local officials can make whatever choices they want. The real question is, who pays for that when the bad thing happens? Does that mean that somebody in let's say Nebraska is paying for flood risk along our coast? That's a question that all of us need to ask ourselves. Now, Nebraska has its own flood risk, so, but at some point, that's really the choice. How much do we as a nation want to invest in that kind of risky development that communities are allowing to go forward? Take it away.
So there's a number of different so the National Flood Insurance Program is another
Sure.
thing which is encouraging development in places that are quite risky. It seems like there's two issues there. One is not knowing the flood maps, but then the other is having insurance markets which just are not functioning well in those areas. And so there's no issue of someone living in a very vulnerable coastal place as long as they're paying the premium that they get. If you want to live on a beach, then that's fine, but you should pay the accurate cost of the risk that you're posing to your community and others if that place needs to be rebuilt. Zooming out a little bit, that National Flood Insurance Program and some other guarantees of federal funding for disaster reconstruction is one of the reasons that goes a long way to explain this curious research finding, which is that controlling for population growth and for other things, it looks like for most countries in the world that the damages from hurricanes, tropical cyclones, typhoons is slowly decreasing through time. In the United States, it has stayed still or even increased. And it's this one big outlier country. And it seems to be that the incentives there are just completely not right, and people aren't paying for the risk that we're assuming in developing in those places.
Absolutely correct to point to the National Flood Insurance Program. That is probably our biggest incentive for people to invest in risky areas with subsidized premiums paid for by eventually the federal government, because the program's bankrupt, and then we have to eventually come in and bail it out, which Congress just did. They just gave $16 billion to this program because it was in the hole for $25 billion, and now it's going to be, with these latest events, right back at $25 or $26 billion in the hole. So that is a tremendous problem for us. In 2012, Congress attempted to get to actuarially sound premiums. That would be, if you're in a risky place, your premium may be $10,000. It may be $15,000. But constituents got upset, and Congress, the political will was not there. Congress rolled that back, and so we are at highly subsidized rates for folks living in areas with known flood risk. And then we're also still paying to rebuild the same properties over and over again. There's essentially no limit on repetitive flooding.
So we've got some questions that have come in on the online system, and one of them, no surprise, relates directly to flooding. So the questions within all this, what do you think the best methods are for working with vulnerable populations who are near floodplains? How do you actually work specifically with them? Insurance, relocation is always a very challenging topic. How do we think about this?
If we could get there after an event like this, we should be looking at the long-term prospects for a particular community. What is the sea level rise, and how much are we going to protect that? And then help those communities relocate those populations. Now, it's a very difficult thing to do. It moves people from what's known. They're not happy about moving. They've already had a terrible experience. So some people want buyouts, but many people don't. And that is one of the examples in the world that's held up of a country that's doing this well is the Netherlands. And of course, the Netherlands has been dealing with flooding for at least 1,000 years. But they also have a cultural difference than we do from us. When they need to have people move out of the way of a flood, they have collective action that says, we're going to move you out of the way of the flood. And you may not want that, but it's for the collective good. That isn't really the model that we follow yet in the United States, to say, we're going to move you out of the floodplain. So, and it's very difficult, but that would be the most obvious choice. For those that want to leave, help them leave. The problem is, if you have a mixed community left, the ones that are left are even more vulnerable, because we have to try to keep up the emergency services and utilities and other things. And if you're having routine flooding, that can make them even more at risk. Elevation is very difficult for vulnerable populations, because if you get a home that's 20 feet off the ground, that really makes it difficult for somebody in a wheelchair, if there's no elevator, to have access to their neighbors in the community. It just increases the isolation. So we're still working out as a nation our solutions to these challenges, because we're at the forefront of recognizing that it's a permanent change that we're experiencing. This isn't water that's going to go away. It's just going to keep coming further and further in.
Let's take another question. I think there's a mic coming.
My question is actually on more international basis. So the United Nations has the Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Do you see any disconnect between what the needs are and what the Sendai framework or the current ambitions are of their office? And then a second question would be kind of with nations like India, where they don't really have, it's still a developing nation, so they don't really have the funds to maybe do risk transfer mechanisms. Like, what are the other options that you would suggest based on your research?
So the whole framework for disaster risk reduction is something which came up. It appears to be, and all research and all common sense policy would say, that the dollars you invest beforehand to reduce people's risk is much more beneficial than waiting until after a disaster happens. There's a lot of political barriers to that, particularly in poorer countries, partly because it's seen as wasted money. Because if you invest for a disaster to never happen, you don't observe that disaster, then the accountability for what that money went towards is it's a little bit more difficult to say this actually helped people. Whereas even if you spend more after a disaster, it's very clear who you're helping and who you're reaching. So I think there's a mind shift there that needs to happen in a lot of, particularly in developing countries, where people working for disaster relief and reconstruction are often ex-military, and they are favoring having a direct, observable impact on people, rather than something a little bit more like a development professional would have of investing in different projects. So I think there's a mind shift in a lot of developing countries that needs to occur around that framework. The funding so far as I know, for disaster risk reduction activities has been extremely small compared to recovery and reconstruction money. And again, that's just related to the fact that absent really ramping up the investment in disaster risk reduction, large damaging disaster events are still going to happen, and you can't just not help people. And so if you have some finite budget for disaster recovery, then it gets spent on disaster recovery, because I don't think the funds are generally there in many countries to advance the disaster risk reduction process. That said, the fact that it exists in the first place is hugely beneficial, and it has shined a light on what people should be doing. Activities like Alice was mentioning in Bangladesh about flood preparedness, flood early warning, about typhoon, tropical cyclone early warning. There are investments being made in that because there's clear economic benefits there and protective benefits. So there's progress on some parts and not so much on as a whole society shifting. But I think the signs are good as long as, I think from responsibility on my side being in academia is to keep pushing the envelope on that research, showing that this pre-disaster interventions are actually more beneficial to society. And I just don't think that work is there, so the evidence is a little bit lacking as well.
Let's take another question. Right here. And we'll come over to this side next.
So you guys have talked about cost with health to the economy, and in one of the previous questions you had mentioned crime rates. Can you speak a little bit more to that and how that is impacted from climate change?
It's also on the internet, one of our questions, so please take it away.
So I'll touch on that very, very briefly. There's been across the world, there's been a very active group of researchers who've been trying to look at the relationship between crime, interpersonal violence, larger civil conflicts, and climate to see if there's any extra stress which the climate is going to have on the security issues. There was a kind of synthesis of that research published by one of my co-authors on this US paper that we did in the summer that finds a pretty robust relationship between civil conflicts worldwide and climate. It's not the sole determinant, and as was pointed out in the Syria case, this is something which exacerbates existing tensions, but can act as, I think the right phrase would be a threat multiplier. It can, in some extents, double the risk of conflict, but from a low baseline of conflict risk. So it's not determining the entirety of conflicts, but it is exacerbating it. Partly that's because of effects on people's incomes. So if you have a shock in a poorer country that destroys the agriculture for a lot of people, what are they doing? Their opportunity cost of picking up a gun and fighting for some resources becomes very different. In the United States, there's some pretty robust results on showing that violent crime is increasing. This is something which I think is known by police departments all over the world. They know that on a particularly hot day to send out more officers. It's mentioned in The Wire. It's something that's kind of generally known. The Dutch government, the Dutch police force actually have a lot of research on this. Maybe part of that is because more people are out and so they're interacting more, but part of it also appears to be that people misinterpret threats and become more aggressive when it's hot because it interrupts the way our brains process serotonin. So there's a few different mechanisms, but the relationships are quite robust. Again, it's not the sole determinant of crimes, but it's exacerbating risks in a way which we, if we can avoid, I think would prefer to.
So I will, just anecdotally, I was a criminal law judge in Los Angeles, and certainly on very hot days, the next day we anticipated there'd probably be more arrests, domestic violence, other incidents. That was just anecdotally we thought. So I've thought of that as we get hotter. Temperatures flare, and maybe in the United States, people drink more alcohol. It just is, they're sitting outside, whatever. So one thing that I'm confident of, I do not have the statistics, but I am confident that human trafficking increases as a result of climate change because you have so many people displaced. And when people are displaced, they're highly vulnerable. And that's when they are subject to being trafficked, which is essentially modern slavery. So we do, just recently there was a report on both Mozambique and Bangladesh, I believe by Human Rights Watch, also noting that there has been an increase after disasters of child brides, with the supposition that the families are somewhat impoverished after an event, and this is an easy way to relieve stress in the family to have their daughter be offered into marriage at a very young age. So I think there needs to be further research on this, because one thing that we are across at least the security agencies have, I believe, strong confidence in, is that people will be migrating, displaced involuntarily as a result of climate change impacts, and that will increase their physical risks as well as their risk to being trafficked.
Please.
I'm trying to do a little bit of research on some aspects of that too.
Oh, well, talk. Okay, good.
We've all seen the damages that climate change has done. Do you think that it's too late, like we're too far into it, or I guess how long do you think it would take to recover to get back to a normal climate, per se?
Well, I'm not a climate scientist, but we've already experienced some warming. So what we're most concerned about is harmful warming. We don't, the 192 nations have said it's 2 degrees centigrade. I think there's some question whether that is the case. As we continue on our current path of emissions, we will hit 2 degrees, and we probably will hit more than that. And we are concerned that those impacts will occur. I will share what I've learned in my work, that we basically have 15 years to get to zero emissions to keep ourselves safe. That's from trusted scientists that I speak with. I am not a climate scientist, so I couldn't verify that for you, but on the emissions, cutting the emissions side, we have enormous work to do.
I would say the 15 years to get to zero emissions would be something that keeps us at roughly the temperatures or a little bit higher than we have now. There's definitely going to be warming. I tend not to subscribe to this view that if we don't get it done by those 15 years, we're all doomed. But what has become a reality over the past 2 decades or so, I mean, this is a problem, I think it's 50 years now since the first US president talked about climate change, which was LBJ many years ago. So it's something that has been known for a long time, and people should have been acting on it. And increasingly, there's been this idea in the past few years that maybe it's too late. But there's been a shift towards saying, well, it's a problem that we can mitigate. We can decrease the emissions and try to reduce some of those damages. But we're in a world now where we have to also adapt for it. We have to accept that some places are going to get worse. There's going to be some of the impacts that we're talking about. And we can no longer think of it as a problem that's just, do we stop it now or do we never stop it? But we need to do both. Try and limit it as much as possible, because that's going to have benefits for us, but also try to invest in adaptation in a way which helps people, grow, keep their well-beings at a certain level. So I wouldn't say it's too late, but we need to shift. We're shifting more towards that adaptation side versus the mitigation side the longer that we wait.
We've had a chance today to really talk about climate change and inequality, and I really appreciate you two bringing your very specific perspectives and helping us shape this broader conversation. And to that last question, we're actually having this conversation here while the leaders of the world are meeting at COP in Bonn to address climate and look specifically both at the emissions and then what we need to do. So there's a huge backdrop of global engagement as we have this very specific conversation here in Chicago. So I want to thank our panelists and thank our audience, and we'll have a chance for you to stay around a little bit and enjoy yourselves. But thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you all.